let's take a look at how we can wire Effect with Cloudflare Workers. So for this, I'll be showing you a little bit of the code of my courses LMS. So the learning management system I created for the practical Effect and Effect Atom courses. Now, I won't share this repository with you for obvious reasons, but the wiring is super straightforward. So first things first, I'm using Effect RPC, and something that I always like to do is create this RPC logger middleware, where it will simply do a tap error cause and then an effect log error for all procedures. So whenever a procedure fails, it is going to log this error right here. Now for the RPC router, pretty standard layer HTTP router, and for the group, the domain RPC, and we require the RPC logger implementation. And for protocol, I'm using HTTP, not WebSocket. And the reason is the server is stateless because it's a Cloudflare worker. So we cannot use WebSocket for this. And I'm using layer NDJSON. Now, I also have a health router so that I can check if the Cloudflare worker is up and running. And for this, I'm using the HTTP layer router to make things a bit more declarative. Though do note that this is all using Effect v3. For v4, it's pretty much identical. Though in that case, you can ask an AI agent to translate this over to v4. And then I have the course layer, which yields this mvars service, which is just yielding from config. So the Google CAPTCHA, the environment, the API keys, etc. And here, if it's prod, then my domain, if not localhost, and I configure course here. And then I provide the mvars. And I also created a private API router. And for this, since Cloudflare workers cannot access the file system, I provide a no-op, which comes from Effect's file system. But I provide the live implementations for the other tags it requires. And then I have the worker application. So I merge all of the routes. So the private API router and the RPC routes. I provide the course layer and the RPC logger live for the middleware. And then I have this with tracer disabled when the request method is options, or when the path is API health, or when the path is RPC. And that's because the RPC layer does its own tracing, and the HTTP layer adds spans, so a parent span, to all requests. So if we didn't disable it for RPC, we would get a nested span, something like HTTP and then post and then /RPC, which is just noise. So if this returns true, then it is going to omit that effect with span for us and let the RPC layer handle the tracing for us. And then I have a with span name generation where we do an HTTP tag like this, and then the method and then the path, just for ergonomics. Now to the interesting bit, so the Cloudflare worker. So here I have the type for the bindings my application supports, in this case just the D1 database binding. And here I have a make config provider. So we take in the bindings we support, then we create a map here where we iterate over the process.env variables, we set them over to the map, and then we iterate over the bindings and set them to the map. And finally, we say config provider from map and we pass in the map. So bindings take precedence over the process env. And then we have a singleton let runtime var. So at the very start, it's undefined, of course, until we get a request. So I created this utility called make or get runtime. We take in the bindings and we check, is the runtime already defined? If so, return it as is. otherwise, we set the config provider using the make config provider utility, and then we set the runtime to an HTTP layer router to web handler. And this runtime right here, as we can see, satisfies the type because the to web handler returns an object that contains a dispose, so we can tear down the scope, and then the handler, which is a function that takes in the request and runs it for us, so bridges it with Effect's runtime automatically. Now, the reason why we're not keeping the dispose function of to web handler is because there's no way for Cloudflare Worker to call the dispose function. Anyway, we then pass in the worker app, but we provide the D1 client, which comes from @effect SQL D1. And for the DB, we pass in the bindings.db. And we provide the config provider layer. And finally, we return the runtime. And then we do an export default. And here we export a fetch function, takes in the request, takes in the worker bindings, and then the execution context, which we're not going to be using. And that's because, in my case, there is no fire and forget work in the server. So if you want detached effects, you need to use execution.waitUntil, which I'm going to show you in a moment how you could wire that up. And then we return a make or get runtime env, and then we do a .handler to execute it for this request. Now, one thing to note is that Effect, so the to web handler, already handles interruptibility for us, meaning that it internally does a request.signal, then add event listener on a board, and then it basically gets the fiber and does an unsafe interrupt as fork, and then the client abort fiber ID. The only catch is you need to enable that on Cloudflare side, which is adding the compatibility flag. So basically in your wrangler.toml, you should say compatibility flags is equal to, and then enable request signal. And that's it. You should be good to go. Now, as for the execution context.waitUntil, what I would recommend for that is creating a service. So class Cloudflare execution context extends a context.tag, and then here we would have the tag and then the self, and finally holds the execution context. And then we would create a run, fire, and forget. And here we would take in the effect, and this would be an effect that gets the execution context. Then we would get the current runtime, and then we would do context.waitUntil, and then our runtime from effect run promise exit. Then we pass in the runtime, and then we would say effect.scoped, and then do a tap error cause, and an effect log error saying fire and forget task failed, and we pass in the cause. And this, of course, needs to be exclude from the scope. And that's it. And then here on the handler, you can actually pass in, as we can see, we can pass in the context. So for the per request context, so if I go back and then come here and say context dot make, and then we would say for Cloudflare execution context, we pass in the execution context like this. And we would need to add the type here, which again, to make things right, this would be a context.context of handler request. So in our case, that would be a context of CF execution context. And context is, of course, a namespace. and you should be good to go. Something like this. Anyway, this wraps up the video. If you want to see more content like this, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.